Good. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the CITRIS Wednesday afternoon lunch. And my name is Ken Goldberg. I'm one of the researchers in the building, and I am absolutely delighted to introduce our speaker today. I also want to thank Yvette Subramanian, who organizes this series, and Lori Majorano, where is she? And Aaron Wahlberg, who's in the control booth. We have a fantastic group of staff who put these things together, and they really deserve our appreciation. Also, Paul Wright, the director of CITRIS, who works tirelessly to provide the resources that make all this happen. Now, as Socrates once said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And as engineers and scientists, we take that to heart, but we want to add a little twist, because what we want to do is always take knowledge and apply numbers to it. And this is exactly the subject of today's lecture. Gary Wolfe is a world-renowned writer and, in fact, very, very highly in-demand speaker. He is a contributing editor at Wired Magazine. How many of you read Wired Magazine on a regular basis? Come on. All right. Thank you. And then he's written about many, many topics that have gone on to become very important parts of our technoculture. He has also been named one of the best American science. He was included in the Best American Science Writing compilation, and in the Best American Science and Nature Writing compilations. He's been awarded a AAAS Kavli Science Journalism Prize, and was also a Knight Fellow at Stanford University. He's written 2 books, and is a regular features editor for Wired, and also in the New York Times. So the subject of today's talk was actually the cover story of the Sunday Times magazine a couple of months ago. So it's very much topical. It's very much in the buzz. And so please join me in welcoming Gary Wolfe.
Thanks, Ken. Okay, let's see. Let's go right back to the beginning. And what I'd like to do is go very fast. And you know there are answers talks and questions talks. And what I'd like to do, if I may, is treat you as colleagues and give you a questions talk. And in order to kind of prompt the dialogue that I hope we have, I'm going to load you with as much as I can in 30 minutes. And some of which you may know. I suspect at least some of it is going to be new to you. And then we can just return and kind of go over the things that are of interest or that make sense for us to do together. So please don't be put off if it seems fast or if it seems like there's a lot coming at you. You're all students or faculty or researchers here, and I think you share my bias towards fast rather than slow. Okay. The title of the talk is A Quantified Self, the Practice of Personal Science. So there's 2 components there that we should talk about, the quantified self and personal science. First, the quantified self, that's relatively easy. We're a collaboration of users and tool makers who share their knowledge about the methods and meaning of self-tracking. We're a users group. And some of you may be familiar with the users group. It's a kind of club. We're modeled on the Homebrew Computer Club, that motley crew of technical folk that helped give rise to the personal computer. We get together and describe our work and discuss our methods and results. There are now regular meetings happening or planned in about 20 cities around the world. The biggest groups are here, New York and Boston, and I invite you to participate. The Bay Area group has over 1,000 people now, and a typical meeting has between 100 and 200 people. We're having a kind of gathering of the tribes. Quantified Self folks from all over the world are coming. On May 28th and 29th at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View. And there'll be user-led sessions on tracking mood, intelligence, attention, fitness, medical symptoms, glucose, language, and many other things. And I think it's going to be pretty eye-opening. Is this a remote that I can use? Let's see. I think this would be helpful if I could turn this on. Is anybody master of the remote? All right, well, we'll stand over here. Hang on a second. Okay. Thanks, Ken. That'll just get me out from behind here. Okay, so we also started a blog called thequantifiedself.com that you should know about, and we're in the process of creating a review and advice site for self-trackers, which is sponsored and supported by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So that's a quantified self. We started it 4 years ago, my friend Kevin Kelly and I, as a somewhat avant-garde project of participatory journalism. We were both a little unsatisfied with the typical rhetoric around the Web 2.0 stuff, which had gotten a rather severe case of marketing poisoning, in our opinion. And we wanted to put our minds and energy into something where new and genuine insights were emerging, things that we might influence, at least slightly, to reflect the values we cared about: openness, diversity, community, exploration, and invention. We saw a bunch of things happening that didn't look like they were related to each other: location tracking, genomics, fitness devices, and data geekery, and asked, what happens if you draw a circle around all of these things called the self? You leave a lot of things out, but maybe you can discover something. What do these tools have in common in relation to the self? We both make our livings as writers and journalists. So our next step was talking to people. And Kevin issued an open invitation, and about 30 people showed up at his office and brought amazing projects. It was really beautiful. Everybody learned an incredible amount of new things. And here's an interesting question for you to think about in your own work. Why did this accelerate learning, a face-to-face meeting among a few people who shared a common interest? The information that people were presenting was all out there. Much of it was searchable and available, or so it seemed. And yet when people got together face-to-face, something new emerged. Now, I'm thinking about that a lot because I'm interested in innovation. And I just thought I would read you one thing which is kind of profound. This is from an article called Geographical Proximity and the Transmission of Tacit Knowledge. And it's from an economics journal. It's really a paper on the geographical dimension of economics and the sociology of knowledge. It says, this is the money paragraph, the point here is that crucial knowledge in any innovative industry is not standardized information, routine patterns, or public knowledge of science. It is also often not the kind of data that can be obtained through quantitative market research involving the analysis of secondary data or statistical survey research, nor from qualitative methods such as focus groups and interviews. What is really useful is what is new, what are the latest changes and specialized know-how that individuals have acquired through practice and mistakes. Now, this is a trickier paragraph than it seems. I mean, the first thing that it's saying is that the most important information is not yet synthesized. It's interesting because it's new. Okay, so maybe people face-to-face in some sense have a temporal jump on interactions that are mediated by electronic communication. I'm not sure that's sort of intuitively plausible. Why should that be the case, that face-to-face transmission of knowledge is kind of faster or newer than knowledge which doesn't get exchanged face-to-face? But nonetheless, that's one point. There's another point here that's more complex and more subtle, which is that the value comes from specialized know-how that individuals have acquired through mistakes. In other words, it's not just a matter of newness, but of something else. Something even the author here of this paragraph has trouble putting his finger on. It has to do with specialized individual practice and mistakes. There's something here he's reaching for, that there's a kind of knowledge that is not synthesized. Something will ultimately become synthesized, but there is a remnant, a residue, that is unsynthesized and perhaps unsynthesizable because perhaps it's too specialized, perhaps it's too individual, perhaps it's sort of the mistakes. The mistakes may be the things that are interesting. Now, I'm going to leave you with that. We could do a whole talk on that, but I'm going to leave you with that because you're going to see it emerge again below and when I ask the question of what is personal science. We think of science as being, in some sense, a set of methods. And the methods and the practices have a systematic quality, or so we imagine. But of course, there's a big part of science that is not synthesized and perhaps not synthesizable. For instance, you might think about hypothesis generation. So just keep that in your mind and we'll go on. Okay, I'm going to organize this for the sake of speed into 3 sections. Icons, tools, and reasons. And each of these, just imagine the landscape that they look out upon. Icons, this will be how I do a historical review. Okay, Ben Franklin. Let's let him stand in for self-improvement, whose 17th century roots in Puritanism, with its 17th century roots in Puritanism, its 19th century future in Emersonian perfectionism, its 20th century future in time management, and the 7 habits of highly effective people. Okay? So now I've just given you a big tour of self-improvement in 3 centuries in 30 seconds. Frederick Winslow Taylor. Let him stand in for early 20th century management science, consulting, human resources, with its mid-century future in the Rand Corporation's fantasy of cybernetic optimization of individual participation in mass society, and its late century future in corporate wellness programs that increase productivity through care and tracking of individual health. Okay, so here you have management science applied to individuals to make them more efficient and productive, and even maybe more well or more wellness or whatever it is they're trying to get at. Here's Lillian Gilbreth. Let her stand in for the application of detailed measurement to improve individual happiness outside the job with its future in lifestyle optimization, including the green movement. She's a fascinating character, and I won't tell you too much about her, except that if you... Is she really? So that's interesting because she moved from Berkeley right before she was married.
She was one of the first people to get a graduate degree.
And she was an engineer, and a pioneering engineer. And she
Her husband, Frank.
yes, of course. And she applied engineering analysis to the domestic sphere. That was the thing that she was the most famous for, including a lot of product consulting and stuff like that in the electronics and appliance industry. But let's just let her stand in for like optimization outside of work, engineering applied outside of work. Isabel Briggs Myers, you probably are familiar with Myers-Briggs personality type indicator, and let her stand in for the quantification of mental and emotional life with all its branches, from the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory to IQ tests to the Big 5 personality traits, all 20th century phenomenon. And then kind of moving into our century to the triumphant success of forced choice pull-down menus that power algorithmic dating sites and many other forms of social media. Okay, so here you have grids applied to our mental and emotional life that in some sense may promise some kind of optimization, whether it's the optimization of our choice of mate or the optimization of our choice of restaurants. Okay, and I'm going to give you one other icon, somebody who you probably haven't heard of. His name is Donald Laird. He was an industrial psychologist at Cornell who consulted for the auto industry. Here's a sample of his scholarship. I just love it. I mean, this is like before, this is when the field is so new he can do anything he wants. He can invent dust covers for his apparatus. He can research sleep, intelligence, memory, homosexuality, smell, reading, toothpaste. Anyway, he was basically at the forefront of the new wave of industrial psychology. Here you can see him touch the popular mind a little bit. Fans of sponsored films and of the Pralinger Archive will recognize the hand of Jim Handy, one of the great sponsored film directors. In this film, he makes a film about Donald Laird's work.
Has developed some interesting devices to test relaxation. With a machine called the somnokinetograph, or sleep movement writer, Dr. Laird can make an accurate record of the amount of relaxation we get when we sleep. This magic disc on the mattress is connected to a pen, which writes on a moving sheet of paper. Every time the sleeper turns, tosses, or rolls over, there is a corresponding peak or valley on the chart. Well, he's spinning like a merry-go-round. Can't settle down. Well, try the other side. Oh, that's better. Comfortable at last. Just a couple of wiggles and jiggles, and so to sleep. In order to sleep well, we must be completely relaxed. So the smoother the line, the better the sleep.
Okay, that's part of a much longer film, but I truly love it because here you have the fantasy in its purest form. The smoother the line, the better the sleep. So you have a device, you have an analytical sort of model, and you have a feedback loop. the whole thing kind of falls apart if you really think about how it might work in practice. This actually has proven to be a really significant problem for people building sensor-based feedback loops. How do you... There's sort of a disconnect. Watching that line or kind of being aware of that line is not necessarily going to make you less restless as opposed to more restless. But nonetheless, the fantasy is very, very clearly expressed. Okay. Now, before we move on to tools, I just want to talk a little bit more abstractly and drop you into some of the deep questions here. If you look at somebody like Donald Laird, what you see is an expert, a kind of quintessential expert. On the one side, you have a subject. On the other side, you have a model. Okay? And you test the subject, you get data from the subject, and the expert is involved in establishing those experiments and adjusting his model, proving or disproving or tweaking the model, which then allows him to communicate to the subject what the subject should do. So here you have basically this kind of, the model is where sort of rationality lies. The subject is the kind of chaotic world of nature, human life, and in between is the expert. And this is something that I think is being transformed sort of in front of our eyes today, both by the devices and the systems the devices are embedded in, but mostly by the users. Okay. Maybe let me just give you a hint here of some of the things people say about the new form of this diagram. People kind of imagine, and I'm sure you're familiar with this dialogue if you follow any of the singularity stuff or other kind of transhumanist literature. But people say the expert becomes a machine. Say we can consult machines to find out what we are, who we are, what we'll become. Or an AI, which is really just another way of saying a machine. Some people like the idea of the crowd or even AI-mediated crowds. The cloud, which is really just an architecture for deploying AIs and the crowd back into this system. But in all cases, you have the same diagram, and really just a question of whether the expert can be mechanized, and that the technological system is understood as an expert system. And I'd like to talk with you about that, because in working with the quantified self, I think that that's going to prove to be an inadequate diagram. Okay, now we're going to go super fast on tools. So easy to find this information, so it's just a glimpse for you. Okay, here's a 2 terabyte flash drive. A tiny little accelerometer. That's the size. That's a 3-dimensional accelerometer. And now, of course, they're shrinking the size of accelerometer plus gyroscope. So that gives you kind of all the inertial measurements that you might want. Here you've got these are the ones with the gyroscopes. You've got a Fitbit. This is an accelerometer-powered fitness device that measures your movement, counts your steps, basically an electronic pedometer. Here you've got the Nike Plus system, and I included in this slide just because I love the sensor. I don't know if any of you have taken one of these apart, but this is one that you put in your shoe, or that's how it used to work, the foot pad, and it transmitted your distance and time to your iPhone. And the sensor is just this little yellow button. It's just a pressure sensor. So, they're measuring how much time the bottom of your foot stays in contact with the pavement, and they're extracting your pace and distance from that. Here's galvanic skin response made out of Lego. We haven't seen a lot of GSR devices, but they are out there, and more of them are coming. You can measure flow of electricity in using elasticized sensors, and so this is just somebody who put one into underwear. Here's you go on Amazon and look at cardiac monitors, and you can see heart rate, and now they're getting into heart rate variability and some more complex measurements. Here's a body bug. They do use galvanic skin response. They use it, interestingly, to measure rate of change in temperature, which is a proxy for energy expenditure, or caloric expenditure. This is a sleep tracker, a accelerometer-based sleep tracking device. Here's another one that I'm sure some of you have seen. It's the Zeo, which is just measuring electrical transmission using a little metal patch on the forehead. Just for reference, this is what sleep tracking used to look like. That's a sleep lab. You used to go into a lab and sleep. Okay? And, the Zeo is is it more accurate or is it less accurate than that? Here's another thing that we could discuss. I mean, what dimensions of measurement influence your interpretation of accuracy? This sleep lab is still significantly more accurate than this ZEO, looked at purely in terms of the data stream, the noise in the data stream. But this sleep context barely resembles a normal sleep context. So you have incredibly accurate measurement compared to this in an incredibly artificial sleep context. And here you have relatively, well, kind of amazing when you think about it, but still, compared to this, relatively poor accuracy in an extremely natural sleep environment. Let's see, let's go forward. Here's a continuous glucose monitor. This is something really worth talking about. This is emerging from the world of diabetes for really obvious reasons. Diabetes 1, genetic condition, often early onset, severe lifetime consequences. People are willing to take on board some relatively burdensome measurement technologies to get on top of that disease. But the big rise right now is diabetes type 2, acquired condition, big range of sort of borderline phenomenon in metabolic processing before you're actually diagnosed as having type 2 diabetes. And so you have people who are at risk of type 2 diabetes or diagnosed with type 2 diabetes moving into the world of glucose monitoring. And behind them come the fitness people. And here's a implantable cardiac monitor. And it's about 2 centimeters. And this just to kind of get you thinking about the form factors. Because you get a little bit smaller than the Fitbit, which I've already lost 2 Fitbits, and having an actual external device starts to look a little impractical. They're just very hard not to lose. You don't have a pocket small enough, to interact with because of the size of your fingers. But of course, you get a certain site, you can just produce the pockets in your body. Like the pockets become part of your body, and that's what they do. They just dig out a 2 centimeter pocket in your body and stick the device in it. Proximity, I wanted to just raise, people often don't think that proximity is also a really intimate personal data stream. And here's an experimental project, a beautiful one, though, where the kids are armed up with Wi-Fi type proximity detectors. And so you can get a record of what kids are talking to what kids. It's very Orwellian and kind of fascinating. We can talk about it later. The theoretical use of it is to identify socially isolated kids and encourage kids to experiment with other modes of social interaction. Be that, it is a neat technical project, really. Okay, why? All right. I hear a lot of reasons. I hear a lot of people describe their reasons for doing this, and then a lot of people on the outside who don't do it, imagining what the reasons are that people would be doing this. And since at Quantified Self, that's what we do, everybody who gets up, we say, what are you doing? How are you doing it? What did you learn? We have had 1,000 people tell us what are their reasons. And what's really interesting is that they often have a kind of oblique resemblance to the reasons people on the outside assume. Okay, here's a really common thing that I hear, that we suffer from a kind of Stockholm syndrome, forming positive attachments to systems which are fundamentally abusive. There's a whole range of skeptical and pained reaction that the Quantified Self provokes in people. This kind of awareness that tracking tools are pressing in on us, and that's felt as a kind of kidnapping or hostage taking, and that the Quantified Self is just a kind of pathological response to that, where people are overwhelmed and they've gone gadget crazy and they just can't take it anymore, and so they say, okay, I submit. I love you. Okay, here's another idea. The advanced users are turning the tools of manipulation to their own advantage, creating zones of empowerment within the Orwellian nightmare of surveillance and manipulation. That's an idea that's sometimes expressed by people who participate in the Quantified Self. Okay, there's this world of data tracking, but I'm going to take it and I'm going to do something with it that's meaningful to me. What's interesting is that explanation is just the same as the first explanation. It just has kind of the valence reversed. In the first case, the person is a pathetic dupe of the surveillance regime. And in the second case, they're sort of the triumphant subverter of the regime. But in both cases, the picture is that there's this sort of world of external surveillance, and we as individuals have to respond to it. Now, as a participant observer and a kind of journalist by mentality, I am obligated to find both these explanations true. in the sense that they're both very clear and genuine responses to something that's going on, and they have to be taken into account. And I've noticed that in the arguments for and against the quantified self, people are responding to a challenge from these systems, a challenge that can be seen as demoralizing or it can be seen as inspiring, but it's still a challenge. This cartoon just expresses my sense of what that challenge is. It's a Matt Groening cartoon, Old Man Yells at Cloud. I mean, the cloud is such a beautiful expression for the aggregation of computer resources within which we live, under which we live. And I like it because it's so soft and so ominous. It's indefinite but ever present. So, is there anything else we can do with the cloud, in a sense, besides yell at it? I mean, what exactly are we yelling about? This is another area we could talk about. Here's applying that cloud idea to the diagram I showed you earlier. The old man, that's us, that's the subject, that's everybody. The cloud is in the place of the AI or the machine. But what's on the other side? Is it a model? Is it expertise? What is the cloud trying to tell us that we feel good or bad about, or what are we trying to tell the cloud? Let me give you some other more obvious reasons. We want things. So people want to optimize. They want to be thin, rich, happy, and smart. Okay? And a lot of the tools you see advertised for self-tracking promise something along this kind of grid, multidimensional grid of optimization. The classic here is Weight Watchers, which is really a self-tracking system, although not highly technologized. This is the Weight Watchers formula. I won't go into it, but it's quite well known. The secret was revealed. The secret that's not generally revealed, although it's out there if you search the literature, is that the results of optimization, even in old established programs with a lot of work behind them, are not all that promising. So let me just read you this. Of 3 randomized controlled trials of Weight Watchers, the largest reported a loss of 3.2% of initial weight at 2 years. That's really sad. Okay? So we want these systems to optimize us. But the evidence that optimization is simply a matter of kind of tuning up the right algorithm and getting it into some feedback cycle may not be all that much greater than the promise of Donald Laird's go to sleep and make the line go flat, right? It kind of should be true. It's just not true. People are doing a lot of work in this area out of really profound personal need. So you have people who are tracking their reactions to medications and other methods of dealing with things like depression. This is on CureTogether. You have people working on projects relating to Here, give me 1 second. I'm just going to go as fast as I can to the end, and then we can talk about anything. We have people working on really sensitive tests of cognitive alacrity involving arithmetic, timed arithmetic tests, to see if they can detect small changes in their mental functioning based on external factors like what they eat or where they live, where they move. You have new sensors like VOC sensors, which are responding to people's anxiety about invisible airborne contaminants. You have people investigating their the geographical context of their experience. This is called a Spiroscout from Asthmopolis. It's basically just an asthma inhaler with a little GPS chip, but every time you do the asthma inhalation, you code a time and a location, and you can imagine individually that being interesting or that being interesting in groups. Here's a well-known art project, beautifully done by Christian Nold, where he's doing some things to send out volunteers and make an emotion map of the city. Okay. Now I'll quote somebody from Fujitsu, from my Fujitsu guest, Dave Marvitt, who's really kind of a brilliant thinker on these topics and has been at QS meetings nearly since the beginning. Made a remark that I put into my talk about what it's like to have new senses. He said, we know about asleep, awake, hungry, depressed, cold, drowsy, nauseous. But what about hypoxic, anemic, hypoglycemic? And I think what Dave is feeling his way towards, and what a lot of people at QS are feeling their way towards, is self-tracking as a kind of part of a new sensorium. Our sensorium is not necessarily a scientific instrument. We make observations as part of science. But the sensorium is it's at an earlier, in a sense, stage of the process than the scientific observation is. And I think what's happening with some of these self-tracking systems is an extension of the sensorium rather than a scientific instrument or an instrument of self-optimization. I'm going to show you a couple diagrams which I think are really helpful, even though at this point in the intellectual history somewhat arcane. Here's a diagram that Freud used to describe the architecture, the sort of abstract architecture of consciousness. Now, there's a lot we could talk about here, but I just want you to look at the very top, in which he defines basically the entry and the formation of the self system as perceptions. The self is a system for managing what comes in a way, for organizing it, for throwing some things out and putting other things into a context or a grid. Some of the observations will be taken up by the self and integrated into a kind of coherent picture of the world, and others will be thrown away. What does it feel like when data is a kind of sense perception? What are the intermediate mechanisms that we need to turn a stream of data into something that is workable by the self? Now, some things are kind of obvious visualizations, but that's just a word. You know, this is where the really deep waters are. I would change the graph that I showed you earlier from sort of subject-expert model to a graph of the self. On the outside, in like that Freudian diagram, you have a sense perception, and in between you have some kind of process. This is the area, if I were doing this in kind of a business context maybe, I would say this area off to the right is sort of the innovation area. We know that the new sense perceptions are coming. I showed you some of the devices through which they're coming. We know they're coming towards the self. All the pieces that allow us to integrate those into the self remain to be made. And we can talk about it here, but I also invite you to join us at Quantified Self, and we can get into it in a lot of detail. Thank you. Somebody had a question over here, and I wanted to get it. Yes?
So you had a graph of all these things with red and blue, red and orange.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. That was a CureTogether.
Okay, there were no labels on it. I was wondering what the labels would be on that.
Those were effective, ineffective.
Okay.
And yeah. And one of the things that's been interesting in patients like me, in CureTogether, is that they've been doing collaborative discovery of the effectiveness of commonly used treatments. Okay, so it's self-report. Now, a question that clinical researchers have is, are these self-reports valid? We have spent a lot of time developing techniques to analyze effectiveness of treatment. And now what you're doing is just putting up a web page and asking people to tell us, was the treatment effective or ineffective? That can't work. If that works, the consequences, the institutional consequences, just to start with, are really uncomfortable. So what CureTogether has been doing is seeing if they can replicate some of these big studies using self-reported data. So as in any case, when you try to validate a model, you need a truth to validate it against. And of course, the truth is likely to be another model, and but you need to, let's just start there. So they're saying there's probably an implicit critique of science located somewhere in what we're doing. But let's just put that aside, and let's just take clinical truth as truth, and let's see how we do on some of these relatively simple questions, like identifying comorbidities. How many people who suffer from one disease or condition suffer from another? And they're doing beautiful, beautiful replications of standard clinical trials. And so, simple ones though, these aren't drug trials that they're replicating. So that gives them some hope that the other data they're generating about, say, relatively little used but highly effective treatments may be worth investigating further. Yeah.
There's this term, quantified self.
Yes.
Right? But on the other hand, I understand this field as the collection of gadgets and websites that you very quickly ran through in the middle of your talk. Right? But at the same time, and the term quantified self doesn't say anything about this collection of gadgets and websites. But at the same time, it seems to fit because at some level, yes, they do quantify an individual. So the term seems to fit, nevertheless, in some sense. So there's a gap between that very high-level term, quantified self, and this collection of gadgets and websites. How is that gap going to be closed? Do the intellectual underpinnings lie in psychology? Is that why you went through that constellation of people in the beginning?
This is a very good question, I think. I mean, this is like a question for a seminar. I mean, in a way, it's really where I led you to. I tried to lead you to that question, and in the sense that let's do an analogy. Let's look at computing, the beginning of personal computing. And somebody who was watching advanced users at that time, people who were willing to put up with the hassles of running a BBS or something like that, right? This was a very unfriendly technology for many people. And if you were watching them closely, you saw, hey, you know what? There's messages being exchanged through this system that say things like, could you hang on for 5 minutes? I'll be there soon. Or, that was a joke, what that guy's talk. I hated that, Social messages. Now, at that time, you might have said, you know what? I think what's being made here is a social technology. If you were really kind of far-seeing, you would have said, these things are social media. But think about how long it took and how confusing it was to get from sort of the PC to an understanding that what this thing was for was communicating between human beings. I think this is what I'm trying to ask here. I'm looking at the advanced users, and I'm seeing that these systems are being deployed as components of the self. They're satisfying this very broad range of human interests. What's inside of me? How do people see me? How can I get better? Who am I? What's out there in the world? I mean, these are big humanistic questions, and that's what these tools are being used for. Right now, if you look inside the industry, or where people think innovation is, you see people saying like, okay, this is a fitness device, and it will help you do this particular goal that you already know you have. It's for optimization or protect your personal privacy, these kind of very narrowly defined, low-level, relatively, goals. And what I'm saying is I know from watching the advanced users that there's some other space here vis-a-vis the self that is being explored. What comes in between? Just as you ask, this is where I think the true, if I were just to say, like, what's my mission in talking to you, it's like you're in analyzing, studying, and inventing. It's that space between the self and the new sensorium that is a very, very rich territory. And some of it is kind of easy to say, like visualization or sensory feedback. These are some pieces of it. But this is something that you may know even better than me.
Gary, just thank you for the great talk. But one of the things I'm sort of also struggling with in terms of seeing this new field as it's taking shape.
Yeah.
Because, first of all, there's the word quantified, which is interesting because obviously there's so many ways that we have qualified information about ourselves. Obviously diaries or photographs, right? There's this huge narcissistic impulse to keep records of our lives that we all do and we've done for a long time. I think there's an element of what's new here is the temporal quality of it, that the sampling is happening on an ongoing basis.
Yeah.
It's not like you're just taking your temperature, going to the doctor for a blood test once a year. These are people who are monitoring over time, and that temporal seems key. I wanted to just ask you about, you didn't mention the Hawthorne Effect, and I wonder if this is part of the motivation. In other words, the Hawthorne Effect is just maybe I'll just ask you.
Why don't you explain what it is, and then we'll...
Well, it's that they did a study where they found that they were curious about the lighting effects and if that would change productivity. And they increased the lighting, and it did. And then it kept increasing the lighting until it was blindingly light. And then the productivity kept going up. And then someone said, well, let's start decreasing the light again and see if we see the... And it kept increasing. And they found out that it didn't matter, the light, but it was just that people were paying attention and watching these workers, and they were trying to please the scientists, and so they were getting more and more productive. So what the Hawthorne effect is sort of any time when, just by simply instrumenting and taking numbers, quantifying, that you actually see a change in behavior just because people are being watched.
Right, right. Okay, so there's a few things that are important there in what you said. One is just the Hawthorne effect is treated by many people in this field as a confounder, basically, right? Like we're trying to optimize something. We change something, and we want to see if it works, and it works. But maybe it was the Hawthorne effect, right? So that's a confounder. It's basically the Hawthorne effect in this field is what the placebo effect is in clinical trials, right? So some people are getting all obsessed with how do we control for the Hawthorne effect. I think that that is a real mistake. And it's a mistake because for a number of reasons, and I think we could talk about placebos too in this context. First of all, the number one question you should ask about the Hawthorne effect is, why does it work? That's the same question you should ask about the placebo effect, because, you know, and people have asked that question. Once you start to ask that question about placebo effect, you see, well, actually, it doesn't always work. It works under some circumstances. It doesn't work under other circumstances. And now we start to get some insight into the effect of belief, observation, awareness, cognition on state, right? And so this is, I think, the most interesting thing about the Hawthorne effect is, why does it work? One of the reasons it may work has to do with self-awareness. You change something and you identify an area of concern, and now that's in people's minds. And having something in your mind affects how you do it, right? That is very powerful. Do not ignore that. Do not call that a placebo or a confounder. Like, that may be your gold vein in the rock, you know, something in there about self-awareness. And so that gets to a very interesting thing in the field about passive versus active tracking. Some people are driving towards passive as fast as they can. Let's get all these instruments in us. Let's get them inside our body where we don't even notice them, because then we don't have to be trusted, which is very kind of tricky to press a button or to do anything. And we'll have all the knowledge. There are some circumstances where that's probably really useful, but you don't get any awareness, you don't get any Hawthorne effect out of it. There are other systems where the actual act of self-tracking is a component of a system, and it may be technologized, but it's still a component of a system that routes through your self. And routing through the self is very, very powerful. So here I think these are for a seminar-style conversation, one could just make a great big map and say, like, okay, here's the Hawthorne effect region. Let's put the kinds of devices and tracking systems that potentially seem valuable vis-a-vis the Hawthorne effect into this region, you know, and here's the invisible, passive, tacit tracking region, and you know.
But I also think it's one of, when you said there's a reason.
Right.
I don't know if the Hawthorne effect actually counts as one, but I would say it's a reason. I want to study this, so I've changed my behavior. So I'm with you on that.
Yes, and I think it goes both ways. I want to study this, so I change my behavior. The other side of it is people are changing their behaviors all the time, and therefore they want to study them. Because, you know, we're constantly being told, hey, look, you should eliminate carbs, man. Carbs are killing you. Do not eat carbs. But, you know, that's kind of a big change to make in a lot of people's lives. Maybe we should know whether it's working or not, you know, and maybe it works for some people and not for others. So I think you want to study something, so you change, but also you want to change, so you study something. Yes?
You mentioned how there's maybe two philosophies or types of people, like the people who are sort of kicking and screaming and in the face of this technology, and the other people who take agency. What about there's sort of this element of self-selection, I'm thinking, because there's some people who, when they're running on a treadmill, look at the numbers and enjoy that, and there's other people who cover it up and don't want to see it. And so it sounds like quantified self is all these people who are choosing and who enjoy that. But what about the whole element of those people who are avoiding the numbers, like, can you make the same conclusions about everyone if it's self-selection?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is another just great topic that, and maybe I'll just add to that question because I think it's an open question, that there's something very interesting to look at in the modalities of feedback that you get from quantitative systems. We think of quantitative systems in quantified self very, very broadly. They're basically data streams. I mean, a photograph is, in a sense, a data stream, right, today? But it looks to us like a qualitative sort of object, or an object that is best described qualitatively. So I think there will be the discovery of many different modalities of feedback that emerge from these data streams. And some will be effective for some types of people and others for others.
Yeah, I think you may have partially touched on this earlier, but how do you see this field changing as the devices move inside the body? Things like brain implants and, I mean, is that going to help to close sort of the gap between this new sensorium and the actual self, or is, like you said, is it maybe actually going to hurt because people are no longer as aware of the devices?
I think it's a good thought experiment, and that's another kind of exercise we might do in a sense. Imagine the total space of the quantified self in terms of data that you might possibly acquire about yourself, right? And some of this stuff is pretty easy to list, and then you can get into obscure corners. But you could probably capture 80% of what's coming in the next 10 years just by simply making a list, right? And then ask, what do we do with that data? And, I think a lot of it will become internal, just in a very loose sense of that word. It doesn't actually have to be in your body, but it will not be something that you have to actively track. And the question is, what will we get out of it? What will we use it for? And that's kind of an open question, especially when you realize how detailed some of it is. For instance, knowledge about mood and proximity, for instance. There's already clinical research going on in psychologists about, like, my mood alterations, are they associated with who I'm around? So just let your mind run with that and ask, like, what that would do to us. Yeah.
So I have a question coming back to your diagram on experts and subjects and models. It seems that you're talking about people quantifying themselves and also experts quantifying people. And, of course, people also quantify experts. And often these quantifications are separated in distinct media, such as, doctors creating records on patients and or patients reviewing doctors on Yelp or something. But in some cases they're merged, like in a well-designed personal health record system. You get a merger of your own data on yourself plus a physician's data on you. And it often seems to me that it would be much more useful if you could add the the subject's rating of the expert into the same stream, because often we want to know, when we look at an expert's rating of a subject, we want to know how subjects are rating the expert in order to evaluate. So I'm just wondering if you've been working on some kind of a amalgamation of these different kinds of...
I haven't seen that a lot, but it's very interesting. I mean, I've seen, the various sites that are doing it for experts, but it's interesting. Let me just take that on board. Yeah.
Am I next? Oh, all right. All this discussion about self-measurement is kind of really reminiscent of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, Because once you take a measurement of a system, the very act of measuring it already changes the system, the state of the system you're monitoring, right? And so I think a lot about what just happens when you put someone in front of a camera. Like a politician, when he's on camera, will say the things that the crowd wants to hear, but as soon as you take him off camera, he's talking, shit behind your back or whatever or just right now, right? When the lady gave me the mic, I was like, oh snap, she gave me the mic. My heart rate increased. I got kind of excited. But maybe if I was just talking to you face to face, that wouldn't have happened, So I know I think about where is I guess this obsession with wanting to quantify things when the very act of quantifying it just alters the system you're trying to measure.
Yeah, and that
maybe you can't escape it.
Or maybe that's good. So that's kind of a little bit, I think it's just to think about. Maybe for some people that is a valuable effect of self-measurement. That kind of self-awareness, which can be self-consciousness, like you just described, like elevated heart rate. But it could be a feeling, say, for instance, of being accompanied, of having a companion, of not being alone. You know, these are some other psychological effects of being sort of watched. Yes?
The movement in general seems to operate on the principle that if people have information, they'll make a different or a better choice. And I guess I wonder about the cases where that's not always true, because it certainly is part of the time. But you can think about everything from warning labels on cigarettes, calorie information on menus, the soda tax, all this stuff that's meant to give us better information about what's supposedly good and bad for us. And yet behavior is largely resistant to that information.
Yeah. You know, you touch on something that gets me on the warpath often when I'm in sort of inside discussions in the quantified self space, because I think there is that exact assumption in many cases that we know what is good for people. Let's design a great system such that they become more aware of the metrics that we're attempting to get them to achieve, and that will help them achieve it. Classic case like obesity. We know there's a lot of people getting fat. They must not have quite the right information or feedback loop. Let's get them involved in a social game that had blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's an amazing amount of projects like this. If you really follow it, I mean, there's money going to it and designers working on it. But the question should be asked of where is the self? That is an expert system. That is like the conclusion that there's a problem, that the solution is relatively well known, and that all you have to do is reach in and pull the right, wire in the brain of a self, and that self will become the self that you imagine to be healthy. That's dangerous on so many different levels. Let me just give you one thing I like to throw out there when I hear stuff like that. Really freaks people out, and they think I'm kind of cold and unfeeling. But there's some data that animals are also getting fatter. Have you seen this? Okay, if the animals are also getting fatter, the notion that you're going to create a social game such that inefficiently educated young people who just grab the candy bar and don't get off their ass is going to change obesity is deeply wrong. And, I think we ought to at least keep our minds open to the possibility that we don't understand human beings or their environment well enough to construct games and data feedback loops to get them to become the thing that we want them to become. So that's like, at the very heart, see, your question was, what if the data leads them in the wrong direction? My question is, what if we don't really know what the right or wrong direction is? And I think that's important also. Yeah, go ahead.
I already asked one.
Oh, yeah.
First.
You used the Stockholm analogy. I wanted to use instead a comparison to second and third wave feminism in the 80s when Madonna was becoming popular and then Camille Paglia came out, and we came up with a new notion that it wasn't that men were exploiting women and objectifying them. It was that women were taking advantage of their own exploitation in order to profit from it themselves, and that there was something self-ennobling about Madonna's behavior that wasn't ennobling about Marilyn Monroe's behavior a generation earlier. And the net effect at the end of this was that you had an institutional rationalization that allowed us to continue to see naked women on TV. Now, in the same way here, is there a sense in which this notion of a quantified self is a way for us to provide an institutional rationale to continue to allow interested entities like corporations and governments and research organizations to poke into our activities and what we're doing, but instead to make it sound as though it's an empowering thing instead of a disempowering thing. If I can continue to give, if I can come up with a reason why I want to give Crest and Colgate a lot of information about what's going on inside my mouth with a Wi-Fi enabled electric toothbrush, Well, if they're going to give me back some data about my toothbrushing behavior, then I've learned something. Now, I've given them a lot of information that they can then use to more effectively market their products, but they've also given me a little bit of information, too. So is this notion of the quantified self a way to provide cover for the continuing loss of privacy and movement of power from individuals to organizational centers, the same way Camille Paglia was a way to continue to allow us to enjoy exploiting women, except this time with an institutional rationale.
I totally get it. Okay, I want to just do something, Ken, if I can. I know we're at the limit of our time. That is a really good question. And I just like to maybe just sort of give social permission. If you have to leave, it's 1 o'clock. But maybe if people could just stay for another 5 minutes, if this room is available or something, let's kind of have that conversation. Because I hate to just end there and say thank you for your question, because I think that's a very important question. So I'll give it like a minute for people to kind of get settled, and then we'll come back to it. Thank you.